Okay, so to round off these talks, I'll just say something, give an overview of practice, really of the practices that I think relate to the different aspects of experience we've been discussing. So as we've gone on, I have tried to sort of mention areas of practice that one can use to work in these different areas of experience. But I'm going to approach this in a different way now by just talking about three types of integration and categorizing practices in relation to. So, these three types of integration form the structure of my middle way philosophy series of books. So you've got the first one, which gives an philosophical overview, really. The second one focuses on the integration of desire. The third one, the integration of meaning. And the fourth one, which is in preparation, the integration of belief. So particularly, you could see the second, third and fourth volumes of the series being relatively more focused on the practical elements of middle way philosophy. So, obviously I'd encourage you to get more detail on any of this, if you've already read Nihilism, to move on to the series, if and when you feel you can engage with it. It's available on the internet. So, integration of desire, integration of meaning, and integration of belief. Now, in terms of the overall, our overall and the same integration, I hope perhaps you've all seen the two donkeys picture in Nihilism, yeah? So that basic sort of pattern of what integration consists in. You've got two forces or two voices or two desires or beliefs, whatever you want to call them, which are in conflict with each other in the sense that they want different things, they've got different goals. But what's basically required for their integration to bring those two desires together that were previously in conflict is to change the conception, the beliefs by which those goals are understood. So the two donkeys are able to, by reflection, change their methods and change their representation of the situation so that they can each graze a pile of hay in sequence rather than in competition with each other, each different piles of hay. So, the process, obviously, they all get what they want, so perhaps we could relate this, for example, to what we said earlier about procrastination. If procrastination involves a conflict between present desires and future requirements, all you've got to do is address them one at a time, through effective planning and obviously enough awareness to put your plan into operation. So basically turning your two bits into the two donkeys, addressing things sequentially. So that's the basic structure of practice, I guess, in all three of these cases. You can see these different types of integration. They're deeply interdependent, really. And already in the model of the two mules, we've talked about the desires of the mules, and we've also talked about the beliefs of the mules, the way they're representing the situation. But there's a difference of emphasis in these three areas, which is reflected in different types of practices which can connect with each other and support each other. So one of the things I like to emphasise, which I think is really part of the way the Middle Way Society works, is that we need a balance of practices. That one aspect of the Middle Way is that we couldn't, if we just focus on desire, say just on resolving our immediate conflicts as we experience them in that kind of more direct way, that will have some good effects, but it will be more limited than if we try and address the three different types of integration simultaneously. But as we go from desire to meaning to belief, we get into gradually, I suppose, more cognitively demanding, perhaps more intellectual territory on the whole. So, obviously, people's capacities in this respect also vary. Some people find it difficult to enter the more philosophical terrain. Others are a bit stuck in intellectualization. That's more my tendency, and finding it difficult to get down to the practical stuff. So there's again, you have to engage with what you can engage with. Okay, so to focus on integration of desire first. So this is really working with different experiences of conflicting desires, however, in whatever form they arise. And one of the main, most obvious ways of dealing with this, which I've been discussing throughout, is meditation. One could also expand the conception of meditation here to the wider one of mindfulness, which you can see as a meditative type working even in the remainder of your experience, even in everyday life, as it were, outside meditation. So how I'd see meditation here is, or mindfulness is, and its value in the integration of desire, is that it's a training in recognising repressed desires. So when you're trying to meditate, a lot of the value of it consists in your response to how you're not meditating. So response to error, in effect, that when you're distracted, the process of recognising your distractions and moving back from that to the goal of the focus of the meditation is, if in many ways, the biting point of the meditation. So at that point, you're doing what the two mules are doing at that point, where they sort of sit down and recognise that they've got different conflicting desires. So that begins to put you in the position where you can begin to take steps to reconcile those desires. So things come up in meditation. You find yourself obsessed with things you perhaps didn't expect to be obsessed with. You recognise what's going on in you to a greater extent. So that's one way of working directly with desires. Another is working with dreams in one way or another. Broadly call it dream work. Because if we can maintain some awareness of our dreams, very often that has a similar effect, to the distractors in meditation, so the things we've not allowed into our representation of things. So our dreams may surprise us, though they may be difficult to interpret. Dream work isn't necessarily about finding a label and fitting the dream into a neat kind of systematic explanation. It could be quite messy. It could just be a matter of trying to make connections between the dream that you experienced and any kind of representation that you have at the moment in your waking life. So I think that's where archetypes can be, or awareness of archetypes can be very helpful, because one sort of simple way of just investigating your dream is to just check through the main archetypes and think, well, what archetype was that? If there was one. Of course there may not be an obvious one, but that may just be one way of engaging with what's going on for you, what's important to you. And in the process, beginning to integrate the desire which is represented by that dream. And then, if we're moving more into the social aspects of the integration of desire, what you might broadly call mediation. So obviously there's a professional element of this, the mediators who deal with conflicts in society, or political conflicts. Bowie has interviewed a couple of these on his podcasts. But you could think of mediation as in a more informal way, just as something that we might do either in ourselves or in relation to others whenever some sort of conflict arises. So other people represent alternative desires, both as we experience them and as they are experiencing them. And I'd suggest that there are just three, to try and boil down the implications of mediation, or what's involved in mediation, into a very simple form, without going into different forms of mediation or anything like that. There's going to be some sort of listening involved, but obviously in order to begin to deal with that conflict, you've got to become aware of what the other side of it is. Some sort of acknowledgement, so that once you're aware of the other perspective, then that other perspective needs to know that you're aware of it. So it's beginning to rectify the balance, if you like, or getting beyond that rigid representation that you've had up to that point. And then there's actually acting on that, or you could put it as addressing the opposed views in whatever way is appropriate to the circumstances. So that may get as far as a practical resolution of whatever the issue is. It may fall short of that. It may just be a step in that direction. But at least you're beginning to address the conflict. But obviously there's far more detail one could go into the question of mediation and how social conflicts are resolved. Okay, so that's some key areas of practice in relation to desire. But coming on to meaning. Okay, so meanings are basically desires connected to symbols. So there's we're representing our different desires using symbols which may be in conflict if we don't recognise other symbols, or we don't recognise even our own symbols at other times. So, the things we've already mentioned under integration of desire may also involve a lot of integration of meaning. For example, if you're working with a dream, trying to understand to some extent what the dream means, that's a process of integration of meaning. It's engaging with the symbols. So this is all a matter of emphasis. There's no hard and fast boundaries between these different types of integration. It's just different ways of thinking about the same things. So, again, in terms of how we practice integration of meaning, meditation can form an important part of that, because in meditation we may encounter symbols in this, ones that we're not normally aware of, ways that different desires may express themselves which seem strange to us in our internal experience. Now, it may seem an odd thing actually to think of your own experience as being strange to you, as being expressed in ways that are difficult to grasp or relate to, but I suppose the strongest experience of that I've had is based on the fact that more than 20 years ago now I used to study Oriental languages, and I made various notes and things at that time in Sanskrit and Prakrit and Hindi and so on, and sometimes just to remind myself of this I look back on them and I have very little understanding of my own symbolic structures that I used at that time. So the modes of expression that were part of me at that time really are strange. So we can be strangers to ourselves, and getting on our own wavelength may be part of what meditation involves. But it may also be a question of letting go of our current ways of, our current preferred symbols and our current preferred ways of understanding things. You might put it as relaxing our current cognitive models, which would mean also allowing weak links to be made with other possible ways of expressing things. So, for example, if you've got a very strong, say, scientific understanding of things, that's a particular kind of very coherent, very worked out cognitive model. One can put out feelers and try to relax that cognitive model and be aware, perhaps using the arts, say, as a very alternative way of understanding things. Recruiting the imagination. But then more broadly, in terms of the integration of meaning, it's simply being aware of a wider range of symbols can be helpful. So, developing our fund of symbols, you could say, is particularly obviously helpful in understanding others. And that can work in a very immediate personal sense. It could just be understanding a friend who speaks in a particular way that's different from the way you generally think about things, or it could be, go all the way to understanding Japanese or whatever. So, there are general ways of working on this. Learning languages is one way of doing that. Languages may not be in the formal sense of Japanese, French, whatever it may be. A particular jargon, for example, or a way of speaking for a group of people in English. The arts, as I've mentioned already, of all kinds, and education obviously puts us in touch with again, different areas of experience that we may not have studied and therefore not really understood very well before, and therefore not really got used to the ways of representing things and thinking and representing in that tradition of thought. I think, well, particularly I've found the visual arts helpful in this set, so hence the evening we had on Renaissance art, a good example of that, of the archetypal kinds of representations you get in Renaissance art were for me a sort of new discovery. They seem to extend the ways that I could engage with things. That's one of the reasons I found it so valuable. And then you can also clarify the way you represent things or the way you symbolise things. And that's where analysis comes into play, and critical thinking particularly. And we've talked, in the talk about archetypes, we discussed one area of that, one example of that kind of analysis, certain clarity, when we're trying to separate a projected archetype, a projection of an archetype from the archetype itself as a meaning for us. So that's a question of disentangling, of discovering, which bit is which, and clarity is the essential quality you need there when you're trying to do that, to work out what are the qualities of that person as far as we've experienced them, as distinct from the shadow we may be projecting onto them to think that they're bad, for example. And then, so one final sort of general area for practice of integration of meaning is tolerance of ambiguity. So if you have, particularly again, if you have a very strong representation that you're attached to, and you think that's the right way of talking about things, people who are in that kind of mindset often, well, they're intolerant of ambiguity, particularly because they impose a black and white view of things, where anything that goes beyond or appears to stray even slightly beyond that rigid way of understanding things is not tolerated, or is assumed to be the opposite, to be a threat in some way to your representation of things.
So why is that ambiguity rather than tolerance of difference?
Well, it is difference as well, but ambiguity is, I'm just thinking of where the kind of symbols that, say, others might use stray slightly beyond the ones you're used to, or just slightly beyond your habitual ways of understanding things. So that might be in terms of, well, I suppose the kind of philosophy I do is too ambiguous for a lot of analytic philosophers, for example. Or this may be an issue, say, with the language used by practitioners of various forms of alternative medicine for conventional medical practitioners and so on. That one of the things that people react to is just that it seems too woolly. But in some ways, woolliness it depends how the woolliness is being used. In fact, whether the woolliness is connected to an experience of something which is in fact or not very clear. That if ambiguity in symbols can reflect ambiguity in experience. So rather than imposing a false clarity on things that aren't actually clear, it's often important to recognise that ambiguity is part of our experience.
So I guess something like examples coming to mind is what's termed pseudoscience, where you get things that happens a lot with things on the internet, for example, where people are selling a particular idea, whether it's a health fad or whatever it is, and they're saying, this is all scientifically valid or whatever, but actually they don't provide any proper scientific reference or, and it's more their idea of science. It's just that they think it works, they believe it works is what it boils down to. Or they'll make sort of references to known sort of scientifically proven things, but in quite a vague way that doesn't actually really prove the point if you look too closely. So I'd put that in the sort of bracket of pseudoscience, so it can look like it's sort of to some, particularly to non-scientists, it could look authentic as science if it's presented well enough. But it's actually, on close inspection, really quite ambiguous.
And we're being asked to tolerate that or develop a tolerance for it?
Well, as I say, I think you have to look at each case, because there are certain areas where clarity becomes more important when you know you're working within a particular cognitive model, and that's the one which is going to enable you to act in appropriate ways. So, for a medical practitioner who's has to make decisions about patients, they've got to have a pretty clear model to do that, I imagine. So you can't take into account ambiguity where practical decision-making comes into play, but very often we extend that requirement beyond where it needs to be. So if we're just gaining an understanding of how things be more widely than that we don't actually have to make decisions about at the moment, then a tolerance of ambiguity comes into play, and that can help develop weak links so that we do actually extend that model in the future.
So it's like uncertainty then?
Yeah, uncertainty is an important part of that, yeah.
So I guess to go back to the example that I was using, that would mean that just because it's not true science doesn't mean that what they're saying isn't correct. It's just that what they're presenting as science isn't actually proven science. One day somebody may prove it as science, so we just have to tolerate that sort of level of, as you say, uncertainty about quite how valid this is.
But there's definitely tolerance and acceptance then, isn't there?
Yeah, well, again, acceptance, if we think of acceptance as for a particular purpose, this is the meanings that we use are always, they require focus for particular purposes. But, sometimes our purpose may actually be to appreciate a wider perspective on conditions. The key area where I think tolerance of ambiguity can best be cultivated is the arts, again. And anywhere where the imagination is used, you're just provisionally opening up other ways of thinking, considering new ways of representing things. And the most ambiguous art, to me, appears to be music. Music doesn't, generally speaking, represent things. Its notes are deeply ambiguous. For the reason they're most reassuring. You don't have to tie your experience of the music itself to a particular cognitive model. You only have to use one way if you're theoretically analysing the music or working out musical practice or whatever. But it's the experience and the appreciation of music, as we discovered the other night. It can have the effect of connecting different bits of us which have been previously separated, which is obviously related to its relaxing effect on us, perhaps.
Another source as well in terms of tolerance ambiguity is humour. That when you look at most humour, that there's often an incongruity to it that arguably creates that tolerance.
Yep. That's something I should add there, isn't it? But obviously, again, humour can be used in a way which actually reinforces people's prejudices and so on.
Yeah.
And distinguishing the line between those types of humour is also difficult.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, that's...
Would the same go for art as well, though?
Yeah, indeed, yeah. Art can be used for propaganda or whatever, yeah. Okay, but moving on then to integration of belief as the sort of final type of integration. So here we're not dealing with symbols, we're dealing with symbols that are being put together into claims of some kind, normally in sentences or propositions, and the whole question of what we should accept as being the case or not. And so here, on the one hand, we may be trying to develop a more adequate set of beliefs in response to our experience. At the same time, more negatively, we're trying to avoid metaphysical beliefs which are liable to create conflict and prevent us from engaging with that experience. So it's the metaphysical beliefs which, they create defensive walls around a particular set of identifications and stop us from mediating between them, if you like. So how do we work with that? How do we either think about the two sides of that? How do we avoid metaphysics? And how do we gain more adequate beliefs ourselves, for adequate provisional beliefs? well, it says that there are various skills involved. I mean, they're all to some extent intellectual because we're dealing with the stuff of the intellect, which is, beliefs and propositions and so on. So, balanced scepticism, I think, is at the centre of this. What you might call Pyrrhonian scepticism. That is scepticism which doesn't consist in negating positions that there is doubt about, but in recognising the doubts and uncertainty about both negative and positive claims. So I think that in itself is quite difficult to do thoroughly, because very widely in our society, scepticism is understood as just a negative process, and there's great underappreciation, I think, of the ways in which negative metaphysical claims can be just as dogmatic as positive ones. So that's something that I think just needs a lot of development, really. It's one of the things I hope the society can do, regards more and more people just recognising this area and investigating it and writing more about it.
So an example of that would be a negative metaphysical claim?
Well, an obvious one is the naturalistic rejection of supernatural claims, for example. So you've got the clear reasons that atheists like Richard Dawkins, for example, can give for rejecting supernatural claims. But if whilst doing that you absolutise natural claims, then you've got to, packed into your positive metaphysical claim there about natural forms or whatever, the existence of natural things, you've also got a negative one. There aren't any supernatural things. Both of these being beyond our experience. And obviously that's got a large part in the conflicts between theists and atheists, just for example. Related to the practice of balanced scepticism is critical thinking skills. So one of the things I do is teaching critical thinking, which is a relatively new development as a subject. Basically, it's taken some skills from philosophy and applied them more widely in lots of different areas. So, thinking about any subject can be dealt with critically. And I think the most important element of critical thinking that's most relevant, practically speaking, is just being aware of assumptions. Being aware that when you make any kind of claim, there are things you assume to be the case. And certainly when you connect claims into arguments, then you've got to start somewhere. Everybody starts somewhere in any kind of claim or argument. And very often those aren't bad places to start. They're the best places we can start based on our experience, but there are also a number, if we're going to start identifying metaphysical assumptions or dogmatic assumptions, just the general skill of being able to identify assumptions is crucial.
Is there something that we can do to cultivate that skill?
There is, yes. Critical thinking courses can be very beneficial in that respect. I've done this a bit on the Middle Way Society website because I have certainly created the beginning of a critical thinking course, which you can follow through. I invited people to not just read the accounts that I've written there in the form of blogs, but also there were little exercises you can do to sort of test your understanding of it against examples. So it's very much about the training, really, is understanding certain basic principles to do with the structure of reasoning and the identification of assumptions, and then just testing, constantly practicing those principles in relation to examples. So to start off with, there'd be rather selective examples selected for the purpose by a teacher, but as you go on, you can then work with any material, basically, where there's an argument. So a newspaper column, or even a lecture or whatever, any kind of material, usually academic material, or it could be in a newspaper or something like this.
It must be a discussion down the pub.
Indeed, yeah. So that once you've got some awareness of those skills, there's endless scope for practicing them, and that in general can raise your awareness of the assumptions that you're making at any given point.
Something that struck me as a tool you could make use of in certainly be critical, the awareness of assumptions, Because that's a feature of cognitive behavioural therapy is a big part. It's actually challenging the assumptions that lead you to have certain beliefs or feelings about something.
Yeah.
And obviously that's quite widespread. There's a lot of, information and whatever on that.
Yeah, that's another way into this, yeah. But at the moment that seems to be perceived as a particular therapeutic help for people with particular problems. But obviously it can also be applied more widely and used by individuals.
I think certainly what you would call a more integrated individual, that's probably how they use it. Because initially people might get into it because they've got certain problems, whether it's anxiety, depression or whatever, and that helps to sort of balance those out. But it doesn't have to just be used in those sort of more extreme things. Once you've learnt that technique, I know a few people who, work with it, in a much more kind of holistic way as a sort of tool to manage their lives, essentially.
Yeah, well, we've got a member of the society, Julian, who's trained in cognitive behavioural therapy, so there was a lot of discussion about that on the 2013 retreat. If you look on the recordings of that, then there's quite a lot of discussion. Okay, so then perhaps the apart from that awareness in everyday life as to what the assumptions are that we're making and where we're making them, there's also a more positive aspect to this, which is developing provisional beliefs. So obviously this relates to education in the broadest sense, doesn't it, and self-development in terms of our understanding of things, and the various sources from which we can gain better understanding of provisional beliefs. I mean, the sciences are an obvious place, history in terms of past events, and psychology and other social sciences generally. So basically any academic subject that really deals with or uses experience as a base, or observations as a base, can be used in this area. And that can also connect with avoiding metaphysical assumptions in ourselves, so becoming aware of the relationship that metaphysical beliefs have with things that we might hold dear, with the desire and meaning levels of our experience. So perhaps just a few points here about how to spot metaphysical beliefs, because this is something people sometimes find difficult in my experience. So how do you know if you've got a metaphysical belief, and how do you respond to other people with them if you think they've got them? Just a few pointers that metaphysical beliefs tend to be fragile is one indicator. That is, they'll probably be strongly held, but if they go, then they go all at once. So dramatic conversions would be an indication of fragility.
St. Paul.
Yep. St. Paul.
Goebbels was a communist, and he became a Nazi overnight, virtually.
Polarisation. So people with metaphysical beliefs tend to disagree with other people with the opposite metaphysical belief, and there's a lot of in my books about this. The opposed, I mentioned atheism and theism, which is obviously polarised. You can have polarised political beliefs represented regularly in Parliament, and you can have beliefs like free will and determinism, often shaped, entrenched arguments about ethics, for example, or beliefs about the self and shaping belief, the entrenched debate about abortion, what is a person and what isn't, and so on. So that's probably a sign that metaphysical beliefs are going on here. Swings. People go from one to the other, maybe sometimes in the same half hour. So that relates to the fragility. Lack of incrementality. So if you try to put it in a incremental form, you can't. So, again, I think to try and distinguish what's relevant to someone's experience in a metaphysical belief, so like belief in God, for example, I think there is stuff that's relevant to people's experience there, but that could be incrementalized. You can have more or less God experience,
People try,
but God himself is not incrementalizable.
Yeah, you do hear people trying to couch their beliefs in provisional terms. That, they say, I sort of believe in God.
Yeah, but that's just indecisiveness, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
So again, indecisiveness shouldn't be confused with incrementality.
Right.
Yeah. But so that's really what I mean by absoluteness. Or the absolute is simply the opposite of incremental. It can't be made of more or less matter, conceptually speaking. There are rigid boundaries being applied. So if you think about the abortion debate, for example, that either you're a person or you're not, it's totally wrong to abort somebody you regard as a person, whatever stage you think you become a person, and totally right, or totally acceptable to have an abortion beyond that point. So that's an example of a rigid boundary imposed on what we can only experience, I think, as an increment. People gradually develop from fertilization through to death, or through to the apex of their development as adults. And then psychological conflict is perhaps one final one to look out for. So that's where I think the role of repression comes in. But people with strong metaphysical beliefs often seem to me to be conflicted in ways that may be more or less immediate. It may be that they have a crisis in 20 years' time, maybe they buried it so deeply, or it may be that there are more signs of difficulty in holding on to that belief in more immediate experience. Certainly, again, that's my experience of people with quite strong religious beliefs, that it sometimes seems not all of them is on board. But so those are just some quick things, and obviously you can use those on yourself when you're wondering whether you have a metaphysical belief. But where others are concerned, obviously we need to be cautious, especially because others, if they do have metaphysical beliefs, will have lots of other beliefs as well. So it's only one of the many trees in the forest. So that's what can prevent us from just saying, well, he's one of those, isn't he? He's one of those metaphysical people. There isn't a metaphysical person; it's just a metaphysical belief. So I think we need to be very cautious in accusing people even of holding metaphysical beliefs. That in most cases it's much better if that person identifies it for themselves, unless you know them very well and are quite sure that they're ready to hear what you might have to say on the subject. So, and particularly, this is on the internet, this can be a real problem. So, assuming, just on the basis of something you've read that somebody said that they hold a certain set of beliefs can be very dangerous, because you've got very little knowledge of the background and the reasons why they hold those beliefs and the embodied circumstances in which they say these things.
Gandhi had a good attitude to this. He didn't necessarily have a problem with the person themselves who he differed with, but he'd just have an issue with their desires or their beliefs. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's
the sinner and the sinner, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously there are many aspects of what we're saying which you can find in many traditions. Just trying to pull them together in a particular way. Okay, so that's enough for me really. But I was just coming back to the main thing to remind you about the levels of integration and different sorts of beliefs one can engage in. Any questions or thoughts?
Just going back to the integration of meaning bit. So if there's, I'll just clarifying really. If there's a particular cognitive model that goes on, say, in your profession or whatever, it's okay to work within that, but just recognise that it is a cognitive model. Yeah. And, So if you're a third-way practitioner, it's like, if you're a way practitioner, then it's okay to work within that cognitive model as long as you recognise it and maybe occasionally prod at it, challenge it a bit.
Yeah, I mean, we always work in cognitive model. We're working in one now. I mean, the middle way philosophy adopts a certain cognitive model. It's obviously, it's our attitude to the challenges that could arise and our attempts to keep extending that and loosening the edges. That's where practice comes in. It's not, we can't jump away from a cognitive model. We can't not be in a cognitive model any more than we can not have egos. It's coming back to the solving the branch you're sitting on kind of view of things to say otherwise. I don't think the cow thinks much of that.
I find for working through anything these days, increasingly finding the process of applying non-violent communication skills. Well, I'm not sure where it fit in there, possibly in the first one, don't know, but because even just with yourself, just to sort of think, if you experience yourself having a strong response to something, just to figure out, what it was that triggered that, and then what you're feeling about it, and what the unmet need is underneath that, and then you can sort of think about what action you might need to take. And so you can apply that to yourself, but obviously also to others.
Yeah, well, that's the mediation heading, really. It's a form of mediation.
Right, yeah, so that's where you put that.
So there were particular sort of forms of stuff you acknowledge, isn't there? So recognising people's needs is the part of the acknowledgement which enables you to then address the opposed piece concerned.
And it certainly helps loosen things, I should think. In many cases, it could help a lot if you were trying to communicate to someone about, a concern over a metaphysical belief that they held. Then that can kind of help soften it by sort of getting to the underlying need that they're trying to meet, in maintaining that position.
Yeah.
And perhaps try and find other ways they can meet that need, or help them find other ways. Then it kind of makes it a bit easier to let that go.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm a little bit sceptical about sort of the idea of need being too solidified, because people can easily rationalise needs, for example, and it's very difficult to distinguish needs from desires a lot of the time. When we really want something, then of course we feel we need it. I need a new car, I need a new computer, or whatever it is.
I mean, certainly in NVT terms, that is part of the process, and actually a big part is actually getting clear about what the difference between what is a want and what is a need. And obviously, there are fundamental needs that can be clearly identified. But again, you can't be completely clear about the boundaries, but certainly things like, we need oxygen to breathe, and we need, we need food and and water and whatever. So, those are obviously very clear needs, but when you get into, and there's certainly other needs in terms of our relationship to society, needs for companionship, communication, whatever, so then the further you expand it, obviously it starts to get into further grey areas between what is a genuine need that you couldn't survive without and what's a want. Yeah.
Well, that may be another way of engaging with our embodiedness, really, isn't it? So all those things you've just said are very much about our bodies, and that we have social needs and nutritional needs and so on as bodies.
Kind of in a Buddhist context, they also apply compassion teachings. Does that fit in here anywhere, as opposed to kind of these wisdom teachings?
Sure. Well, I think that compassion is very much interrelated with meaning as we understand it in relation to other people. So if you think about the development of compassion as it's done in the Metta-bhavana meditation, as I think I mentioned earlier, that you're working there with what those other people mean to you, and trying to work outwards from perhaps more rigid conceptions you may have had, that maybe the projections of archetypes, for example, that this person is particularly in the enemy stage of the Metta-bhavana, that this person is bad for this reason, because they've done this to you, or whatever it is. But I think a broader, both cognitive and emotive awareness of that person beyond that particular conception can be part of the development of compassion. So broadly, I think compassion very often fits into this model in the sense that we have desires and meanings and beliefs in relation to other people, just as we do in relation to ourselves, indeed, just as we do in relation to objects. So all of this applies just as much to people.
So, like the reason, in a sense, it's not there. There's a lot of in many ways, there's a real synthesis between the term integration and compassion.
Yeah, certainly. So I see compassion as just an aspect of that, if you like. And perhaps that's, when Buddhist terms, there's a tradition of identifying wisdom and compassion as two interlinked aspects of the same thing. In a sense, I'm continuing that tradition, but I'm kind of assuming that they are, interlinked. Whenever we talk about this kind of practical wisdom, we're also talking about compassion at the same time. And it would be quite possible, I'm sure, to represent all this in more compassion-focused terms. Maybe my own personal biases involved here. People like Paul Gilbert seem to be quite useful in presenting things in very compassion-focused terms. I suppose to my way of thinking, he kind of recruits wisdom and makes it part of compassion. But maybe in the end, that's just as valuable a thing to do as presenting compassion in terms of wisdom.